Russia, and of course their biggest economic friend, China.
Well, in the West, they kept saying how weak the Russians were, and during the war in Ukraine, and how the Russians are being defeated. We heard that for almost 3 years, and they kept saying, well, they need Iranian missiles, they need Iranian drones, and that was a sign of Russian weakness. Which the Russians, obviously, the Iranians and the Russians cooperated, but the Russians were still going to win the war, right, regardless of Iranian assistance or not. Uh, and now there's talking about Russian advisors. They want to say that Iran is now they're saying that Iran is not able to defend itself. Iran's missile defense capabilities is indigenous, and it's until just recently they were saying that the Iranians were sending their missiles and drones to Russia. So they can't have it both ways. Iran's missile capabilities are very sophisticated, probably among the top four in the world, after uh, probably among the top four in certain fields, not in all fields. Iran also has a significant air defense capability that's indigenous as well. They have S-300s, but they have their own capabilities, which are being produced and expand, and they exist. These capabilities exist across the country, and most of the Israeli missiles that were downed were actually downed by Iranian missile defense systems. So the Iranians are more than capable of defending themselves, and more than capable of devastating uh, it, the Israeli regime or the United States or whoever attacks the country. However, Iranian-Russian relations are very good. They're excellent, and there's military cooperation that goes both ways. There is economic cooperation that is growing. The North-South transport corridor is being developed, and it will be key in the future. It will be very important in the future for global trade. And the two countries have a lot of cooperation politically. And the Russians, they may speak with Americans about many issues, including Iran, but decisions about Iran are made in Tehran. And I am very confident that the Russians recognize that, and that the Russians also recognize that, as well as the Iranians, both recognize that the United States is not trustworthy. I don't see any reason why Iran would take any eggs out of the Russian basket or the Chinese basket and put it in the American basket, because Iran doesn't trust the West. And I don't think that's any different in Moscow either. If Iran has a breakthrough at some point with regards to relations with Europe or the United States, they could put in new eggs in those baskets. But I don't think Iran is going to risk weakening its relationship with friends that didn't sanction Iran, that cooperated with Iran during the most brutal, during the period when the United States was behaving as ruthless as possible towards the country. I don't think Iran is going to either tilt away from them, nor is Iran going to risk putting anything in the U.S. basket which could cause disruption at home. I think the same logic applies to Russia. If the United States wants to improve ties with Russia, I don't think the Russians will trust Trump and give up their relationship with Iran or China simply because they want to have better relations with the United States. That would be very dangerous. And I think that President Putin recognizes that. The United States, by the way, I think it's not going to, having peace with Russia, ending the war in Ukraine is not going to happen overnight. There are many issues: European security, Russian assets, the borders. Ending this war is not going to be easy, and the divisions between Europe and Trump, of course, are probably going to make it a bit more difficult. So I don't think this is going to happen overnight. But even if there is rapprochement between the United States and Russia, full rapprochement, I think it will take many, many years before the Russians begin to trust the United States. And I think the same is true with Iran. The United States has damaged itself immensely. And actually, uh, Danny, I think that what Trump did to Zelensky, even though I have no sympathy for Zelensky at all, uh, but what he did to Zelensky has weakened the United States. Because imagine a world leader who looks at that. Who would want to sit with Trump? Who would want to risk being insulted and humiliated by Trump? I think a lot of leaders would think twice about cooperating with the United States on different issues. They try to keep a distance in certain areas, and they would probably tilt away from the United States increasingly as a result of this sort of behavior. So even though Zelensky deserved it, and he destroyed Ukraine for the sake of the Americans, and now the Americans have thrown him in the trash can after a change in government. Uh, he's destroyed his country. He deserved to be humiliated. But Trump, by behaving like this, I think he is going to he further isolates the United States. So in any case, I think the relationship between Iran and Russia is quite strong. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't, you know, speak, predict the future and know the future for certain. But I think that both Iran and Russia would be very cautious about dealings with the United States. And I don't think that they are going to make themselves vulnerable to the United States, uh, and because of, by giving concessions that have to do with their friends.
Yeah, what's so interesting about this, Professor Marandi, is that on the one hand, Donald Trump is calling himself a peacemaker, and on the other, despite getting closer to Russia or attempting to in order to facilitate these talks, it seems like in every other instance, even with Israel, the reports are now that Israel is in panic because the Trump administration is holding secret talks with Hamas. Of course, Israel wants to see Iran isolated. It wants to see its so-called adversaries isolated. Hell, it probably wants to see Russia isolated and China more isolated because it doesn't trust them to be pro-Israel to any certain extent enough. But when it comes to all these other allies, well, what Trump is doing could very well be disastrous. And if you just read Israeli media, Professor Ryan, I don't know if you have been recently, there is a lot of concerns about Trump's initial behavior and his initial policies coming out of the gate, boomeranging on Israel. And I think we see through this negotiation that they're doing about resume the war, don't resume the war, that they're a bit on their toes as well. Your thoughts?
Well, the Israeli regime, I think, is a dying regime, and its behavior is reflective of a dying regime. They're becoming more extreme and more destructive, and also I think that some of their fears about Trump reflect that recognition that they are not in a good position at all. Netanyahu has been key to the destruction of the regime. He's destroyed its image across the world. And of course, he's failed on the battlefield. The only place where he had success was in Syria in his coordination with Erdogan and Biden. But I don't think that's, as I said, I don't think that's going to end well for Erdogan or Qatar or the United States or Netanyahu, but that's a different story. But so he has done enormous damage to the regime. Why? Because like Zelensky, he's pursuing his own interests. I think Zelensky has been pursuing his own interests during this period of time. And if he was thinking about Ukraine, we would have never had this catastrophic situation. But another thing that Netanyahu and the United States have done is that they've weakened the United States alliance or regimes in our region that are bound to the United States. They've discredited them in the eyes of their own populations. That's why you see them pushing so much sectarianism and racial hatred towards the axis of resistance. That's why all these this Arab media funded by oil and gas from across the Persian Gulf and beyond, they're attacking the resistance day and night because they are discredited. They do nothing for the Palestinian people. None of them have done anything. And people know it. So they've all been weakened as a result of the last year and a half. And when Trump goes and says, okay, we're going to uh, expel the Palestinians from Gaza, it only weakens them further. The only reason why the Arab League had this gathering and spoke about rebuilding Gaza was because of their own people, because they're afraid that people will see them as conspiring against the people of Gaza and Palestine further than before, more than before. Otherwise, they're not going to do anything. I mean, some money will gradually go in, but Egypt has no plans for Gaza. And those who do put in money, they're going to do it for self-serving purposes. Remember, even Qatar, Al Jazeera, it supported the genocide in Yemen when the Saudis attacked Yemen. It was only when the divisions between Qatar and the Saudis and the Emiratis grew that they tilted away from that policy. Their support for the Palestinian people, if the Americans tell the government of Qatar to end it, they'll end it. There's a lot of complicated issues. There are lots of things going on in our region. It's a very complicated situation. But in any case, the people of the region recognize that their governments, whether in Egypt and North Africa, whether in Turkey, whether in the Emirates or in Bahrain or in Jordan, they all recognize that their governments have done nothing. In fact, they've done the opposite. So the continuation of this situation only makes it more dangerous for the American camp. And if there's a restart of the genocide, that could possibly be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I've given this example before. How did the Arab Spring begin? How did the chaos across West Asia and North Africa take place? It was a single young man who burnt himself alive in a Tunisian city because of personal injustice and personal grievance. And he brought down governments. The situation today is far worse, and the United States is far weaker. The United States is far weaker, and as I said, the more the United States is vulnerable in this region, the more the United States spends its wealth in this region, whether in Europe or West Asia, China continues to move forward. China is not engaged in any war. China is not engaged in opening up military bases across the world. It's engaged in developing. And Trump has enormous problems at home, which you were alluding to. The tariffs, the deep division that exists in American society between which we saw during his speech in Congress. There are deep divisions in the United States today, and this is his honeymoon. His honeymoon is going to end very quickly. Right now, he's signing presidential decree one after another. But at some point, the price of eggs, the price of automobiles that will go up because of if the Canadians and the Chinese and the Mexicans are steadfast, then they will be hurt. But Trump will also be hurt too. So Trump has many problems to deal with, and I don't think he has all that many options on the table, regardless of what the people around him say.
There's a huge attempt to make Trump look very, very powerful. But when we look at that situation you just outlined, Professor Marandi, there's also, when we just relate this back to what's happening regionally in West Asia, for example, uh, Donald Trump is very early in an administration which essentially inherited two catastrophic foreign policy disasters, backing the Israeli regimes and in part facilitating the Israeli regime's genocide and regional war, and of course Ukraine. Trump cannot afford to keep these wars, but there's a huge risk that they both continue, especially the situation in West Asia where Israel is pushing because Netanyahu really, 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 really needs a conflict, genocide, unending war to continue, both to achieve Israel's overall objectives at some point in the future, but also to keep his political career going. So this is actually a real big bind. A lot of people say, oh, well, look at Trump magnificently shifting the geopolitical calculus. In my opinion, he has to do this. He has to do this because it's actually Russia, Iran, China. These countries are actually in a far stronger position. Now, of course, their vulnerabilities, their issues, they are also they have to confront this menace called hegemony, US hegemony, but they're in a much stronger position in the sense that uh, it is the Trump administration that has to balance these huge contradictions that could cave in at any time. Iran doesn't have to do that. The resistance doesn't have to do that. They have to. They have one mission, or one mission only, which is to stay alive, survive, and win their sovereignty.
I think your viewers have to keep this in mind, that whenever the West always likes to say they're winning. That's what they always say. They're always winning. We've been hearing that China is collapsing for decades now. And when you look at Chinese infrastructure, whether you go to Shanghai or Guangzhou or Chongqing or Beijing or anywhere else, it's decades ahead of the United States or Europe. They're always winning. We've been hearing that they're winning and that the Russians were losing the war and that the Russians were they were taking chips out of washing machines. Remember all that? And every time there would be some advances by the Ukrainians somewhere on the war front, they would exaggerate that. But it was clear that the Russians were going to win. It was clear from the beginning, for us at least. The same is true in West Asia. They can say that Israel is winning. They can say that Trump is very powerful, but they're losing. They're very vulnerable. The Israeli regime is despised across the world. Regimes affiliated to the United States have to confront their own populations, and their populations do not accept what is going on. At the same time, the forces that are behind these regimes are weakening, and that's the West. And now we see the divisions in the West itself. The West, Trump is not in a strong position. The very fact that the United States is ending the war in Ukraine, which is, by the way, a smart move. Trump is doing the right thing. Now, morality aside, but the reason he's doing that is, well, partially because he has very thin skin, and that's one part of it. But part of it is because this is not sustainable. This is not the United States of the 1990s, the hyperpower. This is not the United States that took Iraq and Afghanistan and thought that it's going to change the fate of the region and the world. This is a different world. The United States is a diminished power. It's still very powerful, but it is definitely not what it used to be. And it will continue to be that way because the United States continues to spend on war. It continues to destroy its image through genocide and Holocaust. And it continues to pay for hundreds of military bases across the world. And its economic model at home has failed. So They can say all they can speak about being powerful, but they're not powerful. And the more they push against Iran, the weaker they are against Russia and China. The more they push against Russia, so the same is true. The weaker they are against Iran and China, and the same and it's not just these three countries anymore. There are hosts of countries that are or entities that are linked to these countries. And now across the world, people are not sympathetic to the United States. As I said, the United States is seen as genocidal. Brand America, brand Europe has been damaged in a way in which you cannot calculate. And the scenes in the White House, although, as I said, Zelensky deserved it, how many presidents would like to be sitting there in the White House risking some sort of verbal abuse by the president of the United States? A person who's constantly lying and, when he shakes hands, he pulls the arm of the other person to show his power. It's good for his base at home, but it weakens the United States. So, but it's not just Trump. I mean, it is Obama and Biden and the previous regimes in Washington that created Trump. He is the product of what the political regime in the United States has brought about for Americans and for the world. But in any case, I think it's very clear that the United States is weaker today. And you saw the Chinese, I think, foreign ministry statement today. Very tough. Remember, the maximum pressure sanctions against Iran, they were never removed for him to reinstate them. When Biden came, he kept all of those sanctions and kept adding new sanctions. Trump cannot do much more than Biden, if anything. The same is true with China. Trump and then Biden, they've already sanctioned China. This is not 8 years ago. The world has changed. China now is less vulnerable to the United States. Iran is less vulnerable to the United States. Russia is less vulnerable to the United States. So again, they don't have all that many options on the table. And as Trump likes to call it, he doesn't have all that many cards to play with. He can pretend that he does, but he's inherited the same United States that Biden was leading. There's no secret card up his sleeve that didn't exist before. And so I think that while we may have trouble ahead, we will definitely have trouble ahead. I think it's quite possible that tensions will increase. It's quite possible that there will be major conflict, maybe war. But I don't think that the United States will succeed in our region. And I think that the Israeli regime is heading for further failure.